So meet Eddie. He was a 12-year-old boy. I'm going to tell you what happened in the beginning and the end. He came to see me, always with a headset on, to block out the stimulation. And he would sit down in the chair across from me with his mother to his left, and he would bounce and look down. And I'd say, Eddie, how you doing today? Okay. Anything new? No. And then in under 60 or 120 seconds flat, he was out of the room. He couldn't even sit in the room to chat with me. It was too much stimulation. And then one day, fast forward about a year and a half later, I was actually seeing his sister via Zoom. And his sister was being treated. It wasn't even his appointment. He walked across the Zoom stage, sat down. Mind you, this is a child who had no dialogue with me that was not initiated by anyone but me. And it was one word. He sat down and he looked at the screen. He said, "Hey, Dr. Milanovic, how you doing?" I burst into tears and I said to his mother, "You didn't say he was this much better." And in her mind, he was improved, but she failed to relay that. So that's the impact nutrigenetics can have. It can make all the difference between this child who has limited functions to fully function, carrying on a conversation, interacting, all the things you want your children to do. So we're going to go back to Eddie and what we did to get him from bouncing in a chair, non-interactive, to sitting down and saying, "Hey, Dr. Milanovic." What you should know is I go by Dr. Rika clinically now. We lived abroad and everyone was called by their first name when I practiced abroad. And until then, I had gone by my last name. And so again, he was seen in 2014. He had the autism, ADHD, anxiety, depression, OCD. So almost every mental health symptom you can get. He had this Holt-Oram syndrome, typically leads to congenital heart deformities and hand. He only had the hand deformity in one of his hands. No social interaction. And as I said, limited eye contact. Would have one or two words back to you, and he would self-regulate by excusing himself from any environment that was too stimulating. So for him, gave him phosphatidylserine and choline, DHA, GABA, lithium. So remember, I'm using the ASCO approach. And in his case, he required hydroxy and adenosyl cobalamin. We gave him that first. You always do the methyl acid. Evidently, he tolerated all three. And then only then did I add the methylfolate. So this was done over a few visits. And what was really nice in working with this mom is that she understood the ways to titrate. So she would move things up gradually so she can observe and see what impacted her child negatively or positively. And in 2015 of May, so we saw him, it took a long time. His mom said, "Hey, he's gotten the best report he's ever gotten." And she ranked his symptoms as 60% better. So when I was heading into, so it was May, in the fall of 2015, I said, "I'd like to get this child even better. What am I missing?" So I attended my first conference with Dr. Ben Lynch, and I had the privilege of listening to his part 1 and part 2 methylation series he sold online, not once, but twice over. And I plotted out Eddie's genetic mutations. And it was, I had flown back into Boston and was with my colleagues from my first practice that I so loved. And we were having dinner and they were all game. We laid out the methylation pathway that Ben Lynch has, and we circled all his mutations and we brainstormed. And one astute clinician said, "What's its diet like?" I thought to myself, diet? And now I'm cringing because it's my first step, right? I assumed that because this child had worked with multiple functional medicine practitioners, including a gentleman that was in our practice but had left our practice, I assumed that this had already been done. And lo and behold, he was not eating gluten-free. He was not eating healthy. So there was a lot of room. So I reviewed all of his various SNPs and I said, these are his main ones. What do I not have added? And sure enough, I wasn't supporting transsulfation. He had an upregulation in the gene CBS. And I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. So most of the genetic mutations cause a downregulation in the gene. Remember, we have two copies of the gene for most of the gene, except for some of the glutathione ones, one from mom, one from dad. No mutations we call wild type. Two mutations we called homozygous, and that enzyme may function. up to 70% slower. One mutation is heterozygous, and that enzyme may function up to 30 or 40% slower. And so he had an upregulation, meaning he's going to create a lot of sulfites. So we gave him molybdenum, enhanced all the cofactors that corresponded to all his mutations, advised mom on diet at this point. And you can see I've highlighted zinc, magnesium was needed. He's not making energy as well. He needs SAM, he needs a little methyl tetrahydrofolate, B12. And so he had these common nutrients that were occurring across all of his mutations where it was beneficial to him to support him a little bit more than the next person. So we implemented the diet or advised her to. And unfortunately, despite the support, anxiety and focus were an issue. And so, as long as someone's working towards removing the triggers, like, why would we deny them the support? So, gave him a little L-theanine that's going to make him more calm. Gave him some tyrosine until we could improve his diet further. Remember, it comes from protein. And here was the outcome. He had near complete resolution of his autistic symptoms. But remember, what I didn't share was a lot of the visits were conducted with me and mom. He was in school all the time. So this is what mom is reporting. So I don't see how good he is. She's just saying anxiety and focus were better. And I was able to compound all his supplements. And for 18 months, the insurance covered it. It was such a miracle for that time period. And then he had a regression. And so I'm scratching my head. I'm like, did the compounding of the supplements change the synergy? We added in testing, and he still, because of the diet was off, he had all kinds of reasons to have mental health symptoms and not be so focused, and maybe brain fog, high yeast, clostridia. Oxalates are hugely inflammatory to the brain, also lead to pain. Low serotonin. Again, I don't usually use organic acid testing to tell me if someone's serotonin is low. It's not been validated. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Remember, he needs ATP, but his mitochondria aren't working based on this test. So we treated his gut, treated both the clostridia, then the yeast, gave him some mitochondrial support. I also gave him calcium, magnesium citrate to bind the oxalates. You give it with each meal, and you do it. I do it usually while I'm doing a gut healing protocol. So for the 2 months or maybe longer. And one thing we did notice is in the compounding, his carnitine was not acetyl L-carnitine, but was transposed, and what they're putting in that compounded mix was L-carnitine. So the difference is acetyl L-carnitine. Let's backtrack. L-carnitine helps us convert fat into energy, but the acetyl L-carnitine goes up to the blood. Acetyl-carnitine crosses the blood-brain barrier and is used to make acetylcholine. So that's our creativity zone, etc. And there's some issues that came up with concentration and focus. And I said, maybe a central auditory processing disorder. Sure enough, he was tested, and the mom was just about ready to start a program called Fast Forward to help retrain his mind. And central auditory processing is where you learn almost strictly visually. So if someone's speaking to you, the words are going to go right in one ear and maybe out the other. You're not going to compute either at all or as quickly. It's a real thing. And here was a clinical outcome. So his autism remained nearly resolved. Remember, I said I hadn't seen him. She told me he was better, but I didn't really appreciate it until he walked across that Zoom screen, sat down and said, "Hey, Dr. Milanovic, how you doing?" The rest of his symptoms were about 80% better. We were treating his dysbiosis, and mom was gaining steam, getting into the health and wellness space. She'd gotten involved with the nutraceutical company, and I lost him to follow-up at the age of 17. But what I did learn from mom was that he actually was playing guitar in a band. How phenomenal is that? From not being able to interact, a child that couldn't tolerate stimulation, do you think he would have tolerated being up on stage with a lot of loud noise? And he was playing in a band. Now he's 24, based on his birthday. I reached out to mom. I haven't heard back, so I don't have an update, but I sure am hopeful that he remains doing as well as he was back when I last saw him. In conclusion, genes are not your destiny. However, we have an ever-growing toxic world. You can't turn around without being exposed to 5G. All of us that are in this field, we like to travel to conferences. We're exposed to ionizing radiation and the benzene from those airplanes, like my young lady who had the 16 vitamin mineral deficiencies, who was an air traffic controller. It's in products we're using. Our rainwater chute is contaminated with glyphosate, so it's almost unavoidable. I'm hoping this never becomes the issue, but my fear is that all of these toxic exposures will not allow us to override our defective genes. And where I find it, genetics or nutrigenetics extremely beneficial is to help support people who are more chronically ill, to get them better quicker, and to help support all those high performers who want to stay high performing and want to work until that last day on this earth. I don't know about you. I want to be vacationing too. I love what I do, but at a lower level perhaps. But you keep them high performing. And I'm really excited to share part 2 of methylation, where we'll cover oxidative stress and hormones and more.
If you're a licensed healthcare practitioner ready to evolve your functional medicine practice, explore over 300 hours of clinical training, masterclasses with leading functional medicine clinicians, and certification pathways. Or check out the Academy of Functional Nutrition and Lifestyle Medicine at afnlm.com. Whether you're on the path to certification as a functional nutritionist or simply want to optimize your own and your family's health, our skill-building approach builds real-world competence from the ground up. And lastly, if you're dealing with chronic health challenges, visit drknews.com for self-paced courses that help you understand and address fatigue, brain fog, autoimmune conditions, gut problems, and more using evidence-based approaches. The content on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your health regimen. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and share with someone who might benefit.